In a moment of raw vulnerability that has left the nation reeling, former President Barack Obama has stepped into the public eye to address the shattering news of his wife Michelle's breast cancer diagnosis, his voice cracking with emotion as he grapples with the unimaginable pain of watching his lifelong partner face a life-altering battle. On Monday, December 22, 2025, the same day Michelle shared her latest treatment update on Instagram, Barack, 64, released a poignant statement via his official social media channels, painting a picture of profound grief and unyielding love, amid what he called the darkest storm our family has ever weathered. This isn't just a political figure speaking, it's a husband laid bare. His words, a testament to the human frailty behind the facade of power, as the Obamas confront a crisis that has upended their world just as the holiday season promises joy and reflection. The announcement came like a thunderclap, amplifying the anguish already stirred by Michelle's own revelations. Barack, who has often spoken of Michelle as his rock and the love of his life since their 1992 marriage, described the diagnosis as a crushing blow that hit him like a freight train. "My heart is shattered knowing what Michelle is enduring," he wrote in a lengthy post, his language laced with the kind of personal torment rarely seen from a man who navigated 2 terms in the White House with stoic resolve. Recalling the fateful day in August when Michelle first learned of her condition, Barack admitted to being overwhelmed by helplessness. "I held her as the words sank in, and in that moment, the weight of the world felt heavier than any crisis I've faced. This disease doesn't care about titles or legacies. It attacks the ones we love most, and it has taken aim at the strongest woman I know." Barack's statement delved deep into the emotional wreckage, highlighting the toll on their family. Parents to daughters Malia and Sasha, the Obamas have always prioritized privacy, but this ordeal has forced a reluctant transparency. "Seeing Michelle shave her head, endure the nausea, the exhaustion, it's torn me apart," he confessed. His words evoking images of quiet nights in their Chicago home turned into vigils of worry. He praised her courage in sharing updates, from the initial tearful video on August 25th to her recent pivot away from chemotherapy due to organ strain, but admitted the changes only deepened his despair. "When she told me her organs couldn't handle the initial treatments, it felt like another punch to the gut. We've decided together to focus on immunotherapy and hormone therapy, but every step forward reminds me of the fragility of life. Michelle is fighting like the warrior she is, but I ache knowing the pain she's in." This public outpouring marks a rare crack in Barack's composed exterior, echoing the vulnerability he showed during his presidency's toughest moments, like the Sandy Hook tragedy. Sources close to the couple reveal that Barack has been Michelle's constant companion through hospital visits and recovery days, canceling speaking engagements to be by her side. "He's devastated, absolutely heartbroken," an insider told reporters, describing nights where the former president paces, wrestling with fears of loss. The diagnosis, detected during a routine mammogram, has thrust the Obamas into advocacy mode, with Barack urging men to support their partners in health screenings. "This isn't just Michelle's fight, it's ours, and it's a wake-up call for every family. Early detection saved us from worse, but the road ahead is grueling." As Christmas nears, the Obamas' holiday plans are overshadowed by uncertainty, a stark contrast to their past White House festivities. Barack ended his statement with a plea for prayers and a vow of solidarity. "Michelle, you are my everything. Our love will see us through this hell. To everyone touched by cancer, you're not alone. We else." The post has garnered millions of views, sparking a flood of support from world leaders, celebrities like Oprah Winfrey, and everyday fans, with hashtags #Stand with Michelle trending globally. Medical experts note that Michelle's shift to immunotherapy, targeting cancer cells more precisely, offers hope, But the emotional scars on Barack run deep, a reminder that even icons bleed. This crisis humanizes the Obamas further, transforming their story from political legacy to one of raw humanity. Will Michelle's resilience pull them through, or will this be the trial that tests their bond like never before? As Barack's words hang heavy, the world watches, hearts heavy with empathy for a couple whose love story now faces its greatest challenge. This is far from the first time the Obama family has faced profound adversity in the public eye. Let's look back at the remarkable journey of Barack Obama and his family, from humble beginnings and personal losses, through the relentless pressures and sacrifices of life under global scrutiny, to the resilience, unity, and strength that ultimately forged one of the most influential and respected families in modern American history. Barack Hussein Obama Jr. was born on August 4, 1961, in Honolulu, Hawaii, to Ann Dunham, a white American woman from Kansas, and Barack Obama Sr., Ikuches, a black Kenyan man, studying economics at the University of Hawaii. From the very beginning, Barack's existence was complicated, straddling worlds that didn't quite know what to make of him. His parents' marriage was unconventional for the time, an interracial union that drew stares and whispers in an era when such relationships were still illegal in many American states. But the complication of his birth was nothing compared to the abandonment that would come. When Barack was just 2 years old, his father left. Barack Obama Sr. received a scholarship to pursue his PhD at Harvard, and he made a choice: his education over his family. He left Hawaii, left his wife, left his infant son, and returned to Kenya, leaving behind a hole in young Barack's life that would never be filled. For a small child, abandonment is not a concept that can be rationalized or understood. It is a wound that goes deeper than words, a fundamental questioning of self-worth. If your own father doesn't want to stay, doesn't want to know you, what does that say about you? This question would haunt Barack for decades, shaping his psychology, his relationships, and his understanding of himself. Ann Dunham did her best to fill the void, telling young Barry, as he was called then, stories about his father. She painted him as a brilliant man, a leader, someone special. But these stories were complicated gifts. They gave Barack an idealized image of a father he never knew, setting up expectations that could never be met while also creating a painful contrast with the reality. His father had chosen to leave him. When Barack was 6 years old, his mother remarried. Lolo Soetoro, an Indonesian student she had met at the University of Hawaii, became Barack's stepfather. In 1967, the family moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, and Barack's world changed completely. He was no longer in the relative racial comfort of Hawaii, a place where mixed-race children were more common and accepted. In Indonesia, he was different, obviously American, obviously not fitting in. The years in Jakarta were formative but difficult. Barack attended local Indonesian schools where he was one of the only foreign children. He was teased for his appearance, for being different, for not quite belonging. Lolo tried to toughen him up, teaching him to fight, to be strong, to not show weakness. These lessons, while well-intentioned, reinforced in young Barack the idea that the world was a harsh place where vulnerability was dangerous. Ann Dunham, idealistic and committed to giving her son the best education possible, would wake Barack at 4 a.m. to give him English lessons before school. These early morning sessions, while demonstrating her dedication, also created pressure. His mother had high expectations, dreams of what her exceptional son could become. Barack learned early that he needed to perform, to excel, to justify the sacrifices being made for him. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. When Barack was 10 years old, his mother made a decision that would traumatize him for years. She sent him back to Hawaii to live with her parents while she and his half-sister remained in Indonesia. The stated reason was education. that Barack would have better opportunities in Hawaii. But for a 10-year-old boy, the message was clear. He was being sent away, separated from his mother, essentially abandoned again. Barack moved in with his maternal grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, whom he called Gramps and Toot. They loved him and did their best to raise him, but the wound of separation ran deep. His mother would visit occasionally, but those visits only highlighted her absence the rest of the time. Barack had now been left by both his father and, in a sense, his mother. The pattern of abandonment was complete, and it created in him a deep-seated fear of attachment and loss that would affect his relationships for the rest of his life. As a teenager at Punahou School, an elite prep school in Honolulu, Barack struggled with his identity. He was one of the few black students in a predominantly white and Asian school. He wasn't quite white, wasn't quite black, wasn't quite Asian, wasn't quite American in the conventional sense. He belonged everywhere and nowhere. His classmates saw him as friendly and popular, but inside, Barack was wrestling with profound questions about who he was and where he fit. In his memoir, Barack would later write about his teenage years with brutal honesty. He experimented with drugs, marijuana, and cocaine, trying to numb the pain of not knowing himself, of feeling like a fraud. He hung out with other outsiders, forming what he called the Club of Disaffection. These were kids who felt they didn't belong. And together they created their own sense of identity through rebellion and substance use. But the drugs and the posturing couldn't answer the fundamental questions burning inside him. What did it mean to be black in America? How could he claim that identity when he had been raised by white grandparents, when he had lived in Indonesia, when he had never experienced the Black American experience in any traditional sense? He felt like an imposter, someone playing at being black without truly understanding what that meant. During his senior year of high school, Barack's father visited Hawaii. It was the first and only time Barack would see his father since he was a baby. The visit was devastating in ways Barack hadn't anticipated. The brilliant, larger-than-life figure his mother had described turned out to be a flawed, struggling man. Barack Obama Sr. had fallen from grace in Kenya, losing his government position, suffering injuries in car accidents that left him with a limp, and developing a serious drinking problem. He was bitter, difficult, and nothing like the idealized father Barack had imagined. The visit was awkward and painful. Barack's father gave a talk at his school, and while Barack was initially proud, his classmates' reactions made him cringe. His father seemed out of touch, his accent strong, his mannerisms foreign. The fantasy of the great man, the African leader, the father he could be proud of, crumbled. And then his father left again, returning to Kenya, leaving Barack with more questions than answers and the reality that the father he had longed to know was deeply troubled and ultimately unknowable to him. Barack learned years later that his father had died in a car accident in Kenya in 1982 when Barack was 21. The news hit him harder than he expected. His father was gone, and with him, any chance of ever truly knowing him, of understanding where he came from, of getting answers to the questions that had plagued him his entire life. The abandonment was now permanent and irreversible. After graduating from high school, Barack attended Occidental College in Los Angeles before transferring to Columbia University in New York. The years at Columbia were dark and solitary. Barack isolated himself, spending long hours reading, thinking, trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted from life. He lived in a sparse apartment, ate poorly, and withdrew from social connections. Friends from this period describe him as intense, brooding, almost depressed. Barack was grappling with deep existential questions. What did it mean to be a black man in America? How could he use whatever privileges he had been given to make a difference? What was his purpose? These weren't abstract philosophical questions for Barack. They were survival questions, identity questions, questions that kept him up at night and made it hard to connect with others who seemed to have their lives figured out. After graduating from Columbia in 1983, Barack took a job in the corporate world, working for a consulting firm. He lasted less than a year. The work felt meaningless, a betrayal of the values his mother had instilled in him. He felt like he was selling out, choosing comfort over purpose. But what was his purpose? He didn't know, and that not knowing was torture. In 1985, Barack made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He became a community organizer in Chicago. He responded to an ad for a position with the Developing Communities Project, a church-based organization trying to help struggling neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. The job paid barely enough to live on, and the work was exhausting and often discouraging. But for the first time, Barack felt like he was doing something meaningful. But Chicago also confronted Barack with uncomfortable truths. Working in predominantly Black communities, he encountered suspicion about who he was and whether he truly understood their struggles. Some questioned his Blackness, his background, his authenticity. Here was Barack, Harvard-educated, raised by white grandparents, living in a biracial experience they didn't share. How could he really understand what it meant to be Black in America's inner cities? The work of community organizing was also heartbreaking. Barack poured himself into projects, trying to improve schools, create job programs, give people hope. But the systemic issues were overwhelming. Poverty, racism, lack of opportunity, the weight of history, and structural inequality. These were not problems that could be solved by hard work and good intentions. Barack watched as people he cared about struggled, suffered, and sometimes gave up. The weight of their pain, combined with his inability to truly fix things, took a psychological toll. During this period, Barack also made a pilgrimage that he had been both anticipating and dreading. He traveled to Kenya to meet his father's family and try to understand his African roots. The trip was emotionally overwhelming. He met half-siblings he had never known, walked the streets his father had walked, visited his father's grave. His family welcomed him warmly, but the experience was bittersweet. Barack learned the full story of his father's life, a story of promise unfulfilled. Barack Obama Sr. had been brilliant, with potential to be a great leader, but alcohol, pride, and bad decisions had destroyed him. He had multiple failed marriages, children scattered across continents, and died alone and broken. Barack stood at his father's grave and wept, grieving not just for the man who had died, but for the relationship they would never have, for the questions that would never be answered. The trip also confronted Barack with his privilege. While his Kenyan relatives lived in poverty, struggling with basic necessities, he had been raised with every advantage. The guilt of this disparity, combined with the realization that he was ultimately more American than African, more Western than Kenyan, deepened his sense of not fully belonging anywhere. He was connected to Kenya by blood, but disconnected by experience, culture, and opportunity. Returning to Chicago, Barack made another major decision. He would go to law school. He was accepted to Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious legal institutions in the world. But even this achievement was complicated by self-doubt. Had he been accepted because of his merit or because of affirmative action? The question nagged at him. Another example of how his racial identity created constant uncertainty about his accomplishments. At Harvard, Barack excelled academically, but he also encountered the subtle and not so subtle racism of elite institutions. He was often one of the few Black students in his classes. Professors and classmates sometimes seemed surprised by his intelligence and articulation, carrying the unspoken assumption that Black students were less capable. Barack learned to navigate these spaces, to be articulate enough to be respected, but not so articulate as to make white people uncomfortable, to be confident but not threatening. During his time at Harvard, Barack met Michelle Robinson, a fellow lawyer who would become his wife. Michelle was grounded in ways Barack wasn't, secure in her Black identity, close to her family, rooted in Chicago's South Side. She saw through Barack's cool exterior to the uncertain, searching man beneath. Their relationship was transformative, but not without challenges. Michelle later spoke about how difficult Barack could be, how his political ambitions and constant need to prove himself put strain on their relationship. Barack was always reaching for the next thing, never quite satisfied, always feeling like he hadn't done enough. This driven quality, born from his childhood wounds and search for identity, made him a dynamic leader, but a sometimes absent partner. When Barack decided to run for the Illinois State Senate in 1996, it was the beginning of a political career that would ultimately lead to the presidency. But each step up the political ladder came with personal costs. His first campaign involved challenging and defeating Alice Palmer, a beloved community organizer who had initially endorsed him before changing her mind. Barack's decision to challenge her, to use legal technicalities to remove her from the ballot, earned him political victory, but also accusations of ruthlessness and betrayal from people who had supported him. In the Illinois State Senate, Barack worked hard and built a reputation as intelligent and principled, but he also experienced the frustration of political gridlock, of compromise, of watching good ideas die in committee. He had entered politics to make a difference, but the reality of political life was often mundane, frustrating, and ethically ambiguous. He had to make deals, to compromise his values, to choose the lesser of evils. In 2000, Barack made a disastrous decision to challenge Bobby Rush, an incumbent congressman and former Black Panther, in a Democratic primary. Barack was crushed, losing by a margin of 2-1. The defeat was humiliating and deeply painful. Barack had been confident, perhaps arrogant, believing his education and eloquence would carry him. Instead, voters saw him as an outsider, an elitist, trying to take down a genuine community hero. The loss sent Barack into a period of depression and self-doubt. He questioned whether he was cut out for politics, whether his ambitions were selfish, whether he was using public service to feed his ego rather than to genuinely help people. Michelle was frustrated with him, tired of the financial struggles and time away from family that politics demanded. They had young daughters now, Malia and Sasha, and Barack was often absent chasing political dreams, while Michelle handled the day-to-day realities of parenting. Barack later described this period as one of the lowest points in his life. He felt like a failure, like he had let down everyone who believed in him. His marriage was strained, his finances were a mess, his political career seemed to be over before it had truly begun. He had to seriously consider whether he should just give up politics, get a steady job as a lawyer or professor, and accept a more ordinary life. But then came an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true, a chance to run for the United States Senate in 2004. The incumbent was retiring, and the field was open. Barack threw himself into the campaign, working 18-hour days, traveling across Illinois, giving speech after speech. His break came when he was chosen to give the keynote address at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. That speech made Barack Obama a national figure overnight. His soaring rhetoric about there being no red states or blue states, only the United States, his personal story of being the son of a Kenyan father and a Kansas mother resonated with millions. He became a symbol of hope, of America's better angels, of the possibility of unity in a divided time. But even in that moment of triumph, Barack felt the weight of expectations being placed on him, expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He won the Senate race easily, and suddenly Barack Obama was being talked about as a potential presidential candidate. The idea seemed absurd to him. He had been in the Senate for barely 2 years, had little executive experience, and was younger than most presidents. But the pressure and encouragement from supporters, from donors, from people who saw in him the possibility of real change, was intense. Michelle was deeply opposed to a presidential run. She saw how politics had already strained their family, how Barack's ambitions had taken him away from his daughters, how the constant scrutiny and pressure affected their lives. A presidential campaign would magnify all of that exponentially, but Barack felt pulled toward the race, driven by a sense that this might be his only chance, that if he didn't seize the moment, he would regret it forever. The 2008 presidential campaign was grueling beyond anything Barack had imagined. The schedule was punishing, the scrutiny relentless, the attacks brutal. Questions about his name, his background, his religion, his patriotism were constant. Conspiracy theories spread claiming he was Muslim, born in Kenya, not really American. The racism was sometimes overt, sometimes coded, but always present. The campaign against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary was particularly difficult. Clinton was experienced, well-funded, and had the support of the Democratic establishment. Barack was the upstart, the outsider, the underdog. There were moments during the primary when it seemed like he might lose, when the pressure and exhaustion were overwhelming. He lost the New Hampshire primary after being expected to win, and the defeat was crushing. The scrutiny of every aspect of his life was invasive and painful. His relationship with his controversial former pastor Jeremiah Wright became a massive controversy when inflammatory sermons from Wright surfaced. Barack had attended Wright's church for years, had been married by Wright, had his children baptized there. But Wright's angry rhetoric about America's racism and foreign policy created a crisis for the campaign. Barack had to publicly distance himself from Wright, from a man who had been his spiritual mentor, in a painful speech in Philadelphia. The speech was brilliant, addressing race in America with nuance and honesty. But personally, it required Barack to, in a sense, betray someone who had been important to him. The political necessity of the moment required him to choose ambition over loyalty, a choice that haunted him. When Barack finally secured the Democratic nomination and then won the presidency in November 2008, the victory was historic but bittersweet. He became the first Black president of the United States, a milestone that seemed impossible just years earlier. But the weight of that achievement was crushing. He wasn't just president, he was a symbol, carrying the hopes and dreams of millions, particularly Black Americans, who saw his election as validation of their own worth and possibility. Barack's grandmother, Madeline Dunham, who had raised him and sacrificed so much for him, died 2 days before the election. She had been his rock, his stability, one of the few constants in his life. Barack had rushed to Hawaii to see her in her final days, but her death right before his greatest triumph was devastating. She would never see him become president, never know that the boy she had raised against such odds had achieved the impossible. The presidency brought challenges that tested Barack in ways he had never been tested before. He inherited a country in crisis, the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression, 2 ongoing wars, a broken healthcare system, deep political divisions. The expectations were impossibly high. People expected him to fix everything, to heal America's racial wounds, to restore prosperity and unity. But the reality of governing meant compromise, incremental progress, and constant frustration. The opposition Barack faced was relentless and often racist. The Tea Party movement emerged almost immediately, claiming to be about fiscal conservatism, but often devolving into racist attacks on the president. Town halls became venues for angry confrontations. Some members of Congress treated him with open disrespect, including Representative Joe Wilson shouting, "You lie," during a presidential address to Congress. The birther conspiracy theory, claiming Barack wasn't born in America and therefore wasn't eligible to be president, spread despite all evidence to the contrary. Donald Trump became one of its most prominent promoters, demanding to see Barack's birth certificate. The persistence of this obviously false conspiracy theory was a constant reminder to Barack that no matter what he achieved, some Americans would never accept a black man as their legitimate president. The personal toll on Barack and his family was immense. Every decision was scrutinized. Michelle faced racist attacks and criticism for everything from her fashion choices to her initiatives as First Lady. Malia and Sasha grew up in the White House. Their childhood and adolescence played out under intense public scrutiny. Barack and Michelle worked hard to give them as normal a life as possible, but the reality was that their daughters would never have a normal childhood. Barack made decisions as president that weighed heavily on him morally and emotionally. He dramatically expanded the use of drone strikes to target terrorists, including strikes that killed American citizens abroad without trial. These decisions, while defended as necessary for national security, troubled Barack deeply. He was ordering the deaths of people, sometimes knowing that civilians might die as collateral damage. The weight of those decisions, of being responsible for death, was something he carried constantly. The attack on the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, in 2012, which resulted in the deaths of 4 Americans, including Ambassador Chris Stevens, was another source of pain and frustration. Barack was attacked relentlessly for his administration's handling of the situation, even as investigations repeatedly found no wrongdoing. But the deaths themselves, the knowledge that people serving their country had died on his watch, was a burden. The failure to close Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, despite it being one of his first promises as president, represented the gap between Barack's ideals and the reality of political power. He genuinely wanted to close the facility, believing it represented a betrayal of American values. But Congress blocked him at every turn, and the issue became a symbol of his inability to achieve some of his most important goals. The fight over healthcare reform, which consumed much of his first term, was exhausting and demoralizing. Barack believed deeply that every American deserved access to healthcare, but the political battle to achieve even modest reform was brutal. He had to compromise on key provisions, including the public option he had supported. The final bill, the Affordable Care Act, was a significant achievement, extending coverage to millions. But it fell short of the universal health care Barack had envisioned, and the political cost was enormous. The 2010 midterm elections, when Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives in a massive repudiation, felt like a personal rejection. Barack internalized the loss, questioning whether he had pushed too hard, whether he had misread the country, whether his presidency was failing. The next 6 years would be marked by political gridlock, with a hostile Congress blocking most of his agenda. Mass shootings became a recurring nightmare during Barack's presidency. Tucson, Aurora, Newtown, Charleston, Orlando, each one a tragedy that left him feeling helpless and frustrated. After the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012, when 20 children and 6 adults were murdered, Barack wept openly while addressing the nation. He pushed for gun control legislation, believing that surely the death of children would move Congress to act. But the legislation failed, and Barack later said it was the greatest frustration of his presidency, the area where he felt he had most completely failed. The racial tensions that erupted during his presidency were painful in a deeply personal way. The murders of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, and so many others, and the protests that followed, including the Black Lives Matter movement, confronted Barack with the persistent reality of racism in America. He had hoped his presidency might help heal racial divisions, but instead, it seemed to expose how deep those divisions ran. Barack tried to speak about race honestly, saying that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin, but his words were attacked as divisive or not supportive enough. He couldn't win. If he spoke too directly about racism, He was accused of playing the race card or being divisive. If he didn't speak directly enough, he was accused of not caring about black lives. The impossible position of being America's first black president, expected to represent everyone while also representing black Americans specifically, was emotionally exhausting. The rise of Donald Trump and his election in 2016 to succeed Barack was devastating on multiple levels. Trump had been one of the leading birthers, questioning Barack's legitimacy for years. He ran a campaign that seemed designed to repudiate everything Barack stood for: hope, unity, measured rhetoric, decency in public discourse. When Trump won, defeating Hillary Clinton in a shocking upset, it felt to Barack like a personal rejection, a repudiation of his 8 years of work. Barack had campaigned hard for Clinton, believing Trump was uniquely unfit for the presidency. Trump's victory suggested that either Barack had misjudged the country or that a significant portion of Americans had voted specifically to reject his legacy. The pain of that realization, that his presidency might be viewed by history as an aberration rather than a turning point, was profound. Leaving the White House in January 2017 and watching Trump be sworn in as his successor was one of the most difficult days of Barack's life. He maintained dignity and grace, following the traditions of peaceful transfer of power, but inside, he was devastated. Much of what he had worked for would be undone by his successor. Environmental protections, healthcare reforms, international agreements, all would be targeted for reversal. In the years since leaving office, Barack has tried to find meaning and purpose outside of the presidency. He and Michelle signed a massive book deal and production deal with Netflix. They've worked on the Obama Foundation and various initiatives. But there's a sense of restlessness, of searching for what comes next when you've already reached the highest peak. Barack's post-presidency has been marked by a certain melancholy. He's written and spoken about the limitations of what he was able to achieve, the compromises he had to make, the ways the system resisted change. There's a wistfulness in his reflections, a sense that he gave everything he had, but it wasn't enough, that the change he promised was harder to achieve than he had believed possible. His relationship with Michelle has remained strong, but Michelle has been candid about the strains the presidency put on their marriage. She's spoken about feeling like a single mother during those years, about the resentment she felt at times, about how hard it was to maintain their connection when Barack was consumed by the demands of the office. They've worked on their relationship in the years since. But the scars remain. Barack's legacy remains contested and complex. To his supporters, he was a transformative figure who brought dignity, intelligence, and integrity to the office during difficult times. To his critics, he was a disappointment who promised transformation but delivered incrementalism, who failed to bridge divides and left the country more polarized than he found it. The truth, as Barack himself would likely acknowledge, lies somewhere in between. The boy who was abandoned by his father, sent away by his mother, and spent his life searching for identity and belonging, rose to become President of the United States. It's an extraordinary achievement, the kind of success story that seems to validate the American dream. But for Barack himself, the journey has been marked by profound loneliness, impossible expectations, and the persistent feeling that no achievement is quite enough, that he's still searching for something just beyond reach. Barack Obama's tragedy is not that he failed, but that success brought its own kind of pain. He achieved what seemed impossible, but the achievement came with burdens that few can understand. The weight of representation, the impossibility of meeting everyone's expectations, the loneliness of power, and the knowledge that even at the pinnacle of success, the wounds of childhood abandonment and the search for identity never fully heal. He inspired millions, changed history, and yet remains, in some fundamental way, the boy he always was, still searching, still striving, still trying to prove that he belongs, that he was enough, that the father who left him and the mother who sent him away would be proud of what he became.